Good evening and welcome again. In this lecture we will be adding a death functionality to the player. So another thing which unfortunately we won't be able to test immediately, but the logic behind this one's really simple, so I think that it won't hurt to just get this out of the way. And that means that essentially then we've built quite a nice big player blueprint and almost everything's ready for us to slot straight into the game, which I think is a nice way to proceed when you're first prototyping out a game and fleshing out the functionality. So to do this, if we just go to the bottom of the player blueprint, we can right click here and we want to find a built-in event called any damage. So just type any damage. And all this does is this has a listener on it, so it will essentially pick up any call which calls damage and involves this actor. So basically this means that we don't need to be too specific when we're using the enemy projectiles. All the enemy projectile will need to do is if it hits something, it will check if it's hit the player, and if it has, it will just say do damage, and the player will sort the rest of it out. It means that the enemy projectile then doesn't need to know too much about how it's damaging things, or the health that's involved or anything like that. It's just going to call the function and then let the player deal with the damage it's receiving. So it's quite a nice tidy way to do things. So what we need to do first of all is the first thing we're going to pull off is a pin to set the health. So if we get the health, and again just to recap, this is health not max health that we'll be changing, and all we'll do, so the enemy projectile when we set it up will be passing in a value, so we'll be able to give each projectile a different amount of damage to deal, and that is the number that this will see. And we will be taking that value away, so a float minus a float. So we will take away whatever it gives us from the current health. So we'll just drag health in there. So we'll get the value of the health and we'll take away whatever the damage is that's passed in. And then from this we're going to drag off a clamp. So a clamp float. So this will clamp this value between two values that we give it. And the values that we give it will be 0. So we could have left that as it was. And the second value will be maximum health. So this means that whatever the equation of this comes out to be, it will not be less than 0 or more than the maximum health. So it means we can't do anything strange, we can't accidentally add health to the player by shooting him. And it also means that we can add health if we do something really strange, but it won't give him more health than the maximum health he should have. So it caps the weirdness at least. And we will not go below the value of 0. So as soon as we get to 0, as far as we're concerned, the player's dead anyway. And we just need to pull this out a little bit further, and we will, whatever the value is that's returned from this equation, we're going to pass into health. So when he takes damage, we're going to set the health to be the health minus the health clamped between some realistic values. And then we're just going to do a simple branch check again, so we'll get a branch. And this is going to be the same as what we've seen previously. It's going to be a less than or equal to check, and it will be a less than or equal to float. So if at this point, if the value we get for the health, so we'll pull this in, it is the health. If the value we get after this is less than or equal to 0, so if he has no health at all, then we're going to fire off and we will decide that the player has died. Now before we do this, we're going to need to do something which is new. We've not come across this yet, so I'll explain this in a little bit of detail. We're doing something called casting, so we're going to cast to a different blueprint type. The blueprint type we want is the game mode, not just because it's the only other type we have at the moment, but also because it has the player dead boolean that we're interested in, if you remember making this one a little while back. So from this branch, what we do is we pull out and we cast to BP game mode. So that's our game mode that we made earlier. And what this does is this will give us a reference to that game mode. We can't access anything in here without casting to it first of all to make sure it exists, and just to reveal some of the values inside of it really. And to do that, from the object pin, we're going to get game mode. And quite simply, all this does, this will return the currently used game mode. And as we only have one game mode, we can guarantee that the currently used game mode will be the one that we have set just here. So that's now all coming together. And all we want to do is, where it says in this pin as game mode, this is the part which gives us access to variables which have been revealed in the BP game mode. So from here we will set the player is dead, or player dead, that's what it's called. So we'll set player dead and we'll give that a tick. So now what we've done is we've not just told the player they're dead, we've told the entire game that the player's dead. And what this means is that we can then let the game take control when we start setting up more functionality in the game mode. We can then let the game take control of what it thinks it needs to do in the event that the player dies. Because obviously we don't want the player blueprint to be in control of what happens to the game when he dies. This is why we revealed the variable in the game mode, rather than, I did say that at first thought it might be logical to check whether the player's dead himself, which is all good. The player might need to know that for some reason, but the main functionality of what happens when the player's dead should be expected to work from the game mode. Just the reason I said that you wouldn't want the player being in control, or you wouldn't want the player blueprint being in control of what happens when it dies. Now we will need to come back and flesh out a lot more functionality to the death section of the player later on, but because we won't be able to even kind of pre-fill that with empty functions like we have so far, what we'll do is for now we'll just destroy actor, and this will simply, you can see here the target is self, this will simply destroy the player object. So it's not going to be very fancy for the time being, but when we've got enemies and when they can start damaging us, as soon as the player's died, the object will just disappear. So that is the death functionality finished. So I'm just going to comment here, and we'll just comment this as player death. That's all it's doing. So that will be controlling the death of the player. We'll feed that back to the game mode to let the game We'll feed that back to the game mode to let the game mode know that the player's dead, and when we start, as I said, fleshing this out, that will do something based on whether the player's alive or not. But as far as the player's aware, it doesn't really matter to the player whether or not he's dead, because as soon as he has died, he's just going to be destroyed anyway, so he doesn't really need to know. The only thing that was important is, if you remember, we have a rotation up here. So we're kind of doing a check here to see if the player's dead, but we're doing that more based on the health. And this just stops the player from rotating, doing that fancy lerp thing if the player's not alive. And the only reason for that is because the lerping goes on, it's not just an instant start-stop thing. If you get killed midway through lerping during the rotation, the blueprint kind of has an imprint knowing that it was meant to finish something off, but it wasn't able to because we've destroyed the actor. So what this is doing is it's only going to allow this rotation call to be continued for as long as the player's alive anyway. So it just stops us being given any errors or warnings saying that you're trying to rotate something that no longer exists. So now that we've started talking about the death of the player, that should start making a bit more sense as well. So that is the player functionality quite fully fleshed out for now. There's, as I said, some things we'll come back to later on, but for the time being we have most of the functions we need and it is working in the game. So I will leave that there for this lecture and I will see you in the next.